An intricate building has a rich array of scales, from that of the hand, the foot, the arm, and the body, up to the scale of the city or the landscape of which it is a part. Second, an intricate building rewards all the senses: sight, sound, touch, smell, through its orchestration of light and shade, silence and echo, rough and smooth, cool and warm, high and low, close and far, soft and hard, simple and complex sense. One of the great pleasures when I return to our house in Cambridge is you can smell it.
Became part of, along with Richard Waite at the Architects Journal, a kind of informal pressure group to try to stop Glasgow City Council from desecration of the best building in Scotland since the Second World War. And out of this grew a friendship between John and I interviewed him for a magazine that I had just begun to edit and publish. And I realised that there was a lot more to say. One of the curious things about the borough is that it's completely contemporary, I believe. Our reconciliation of an interest in historical architecture and the urgent impetus towards a reconciliation of architecture with the natural world is achieved in that building, I think, in a way which is utterly exemplary for practice today. And yet its authors, for various complex reasons, distance themselves from the contemporary architectural debate. And in fact, when John took over Colin Rowe's job, and then when John left to go to America, Robin Middleton took over his job, and then Dalrymple Wesley and Peter Carl came into Cambridge. I think what was happening was that Sandy Wilson was attempting, as head of school, to counter the Martin Centre's employment of Lionel March and other mathematicians. And Dalrymple used to say that when he taught in this building, in the room next door was Leon Creer, on the other side was Peter Cook. And he was attempting to find a via media, as it were, between the two. And actually, I think that what John represents as an architect and as a teacher is a middle way between art history and hermeneutics and scholarship on the one hand, and formal analysis of architecture on the other. And that reconciles itself through geometry and experience in architecture. Anyway, because the publishing house gives me the opportunity to do effectively things that I think are beautiful and worth supporting, and unlike buildings that take the best part of a decade often to realise, you can go from idea to realisation in less than a year. This thing, I think, is a way of consolidating conversation between John and I, and is a kind of offering. We're going around the country. In Cambridge last night, we're speaking at the CAS on Monday, and then we're going to Liverpool next week as well. But what the book does is it's an anthos, so it's a collection of flowers, an anthology, and it has within it all of John's published buildings and a reference to a kind of bibliography for future scholars. It's my contention that he's at least as good as a lot of people who were much better at publicising themselves and much more extreme in their polemic, but much less nuanced in their creative imagination. I'm going to read you a couple of parts of the book which hopefully kind of situate the idea behind this creative endeavour that we're engaged in. The piece I'm going to read you part of is called The Long Game, because I think what John is evidence of is that architecture is a very, very long game. On Intricacy is perhaps unusual that it's not a monograph, nor is it a hagiography. John Mounier, is still alive.
Barely.
On Intricacy, celebrates and proselytises the ideas that John has articulated throughout his career. On Intricacy is not a book about him as such, nor simply a book by him, but a book with him. And it reflects his life's work as an architect and teacher in the UK and USA. On Intricacy is concerned with the deep reciprocity of ethics and aesthetics in human ecology and culture. Intricacy is not so much an aesthetic term, although it is a sign of quality in artistic work, as something intrinsic to human situations. Intricacy is something that architecture does or doesn't reflect. And when it does, it tends to be lifelike, vital, and therefore good.
Thank you, Patrick.
Patrick said about the idea that this seems like, let's talk about the borough, about the project being, about building being perhaps of our time, being so relevant to our time. And I've visited two of John's buildings, his house and the borough. And they ground you in the absolute now, and they invite you to attend to nature. In other words, they remind you, I suppose, of our ultimate humility. Sitting in the living room, or perhaps sitting at the table, having lunch together, and sort of looking at the way in which, or feeling the way in which this building reaches out into the landscape. This plinth of masonry that then has these two forms, spaces, a few more spaces I suppose, but fundamentally it sets up this extraordinary composition of solid space that relates to a world outside. And I just think that although it ends up happening in a quite a different way at the borough, it does a similar thing, which is to, as it were, cast a net out into the landscape and to draw it in, but also to invite you out. And that's an extraordinary thing to have done, and for me to have had the good fortune to enjoy.
Do you want to go in front?